My name is Susan Cooke. I'm the Director of Programming for Kellogg Raisonné Scholars Association. I hope each of you have received a flyer that has the professional bios of our four speakers today, because I'm not going to go into that, but you can read that at your leisure. CRSA was founded in 1993 as an affiliated society of the College Art Association. We are a volunteer organization designed to create a community for scholars who are working on catalogs raisonné or thinking about working on them, or simply interested in the processes and subjects and issues that such publications, either in print or online, raise. It would be really great. This session actually grew out of questions and requests for assistance that we received over the years from scholars who had accumulated, in many cases, great troves of personal papers, research notes in print form or increasingly now in digital form, and were concerned about what would happen to that material, wanting to place it. It would be really wonderful if there was some kind of match, kind of app between that scholars could sign up for, create a profile, make yourself attractive or your papers attractive, and hope that some suitor would come calling. As far as I know, that doesn't exist. So it really requires, in many ways, a kind of entrepreneurial attitude on the part of scholars, and that's not something we're always trained for or comfortable with. I think it's a question really of not only assessing what you think is of value in the papers you have, but what you think others will find of value from their point of view, and then trying to make it easy for them by preparing the papers or defining them in some ways so that it's a very nice relationship that works for both sides. And those are really the topics that our four speakers from various angles are going to address. Sally Brazil will talk based on her experience working with the acquisition of papers for the Frick Collection and Art Reference Library. Sheila Schwartz will talk about her experience preparing papers for the Saul Steinberg Foundation, for Saul Steinberg's papers that were given to the Beinecke, and also the papers of the art historian Leo Steinberg, which went to the Getty. Fausto Nicolai will talk about it from the point of view of a scholar's papers, Francis Perkins, that are owned by an Italian collection, and his work having sort of fallen upon them and how he has worked with them and organized them and the value that they've yielded for his research and for other people as well. And then Avis Berman will wrap it up by discussing a broad overview of various ways to think about the problem and think about it as not a problem, but as an opportunity, and to get ahead of that by taking certain steps even before perhaps you think you're ready to relinquish your papers. So I would invite our first speaker up, Sally Brazil.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming to this session. I'm going to sort of go lickety-split through some of the things that I consider when we're looking to take in archival, our scholars' papers into the Frick Collection or the Frick Art Reference Library, which is where I am based. I report into the chief librarian there. And the easiest one for me has been legacy, because when I came 22 years ago, we had a very large number of collections that had been given to us by scholars in the 20s, 30s, and 40s who had actually done their work at the Frick and with the photo archive there and the rich collections that largely related to American painters. We also field many unsolicited offers from folks in this audience and from other places to see if we were interested in making a home for their collections of either single topics or related to a book that they're writing or their entire collection of their decades worth of scholarship or solicited offers. We also have we've been one example of that is we had a gift, a financial gift given to us from the estate of a art historian out in California, and our intrepid chief librarian saw an opportunity and asked if the papers had also been given somewhere else, and they had not, so they've come to us, and they offered more papers. And another group that I deal with a lot are indirect gifts from second or third parties, which are we are given a gift of a scholar's papers, and within those are perhaps the records of another scholar who has passed away, or for whatever reason this person has acquired them. This is not all that common, but we have one large collection of Richard Wonder papers that have another collection within them. And there's also purchase. I should say I have, in my time at the Frick, we have not purchased a scholar's papers, but I think that happens in certain institutions, and that's something, an avenue you may want to consider if that matters a lot to you. There's general acquisition considerations that I take into account, which is the first and foremost is a relevance to the collecting scope of the library and the Frick collection. The library collecting policy really is from the Western art in the Western tradition from the 4th century to really the mid-20th century. So those are the sorts of collections topics that we're interested in. And also the Frick collection, which, as many of you know, has beautiful old master paintings, impressionist paintings, some not so much of that, and decorative arts. So we'd be interested in decorative art archives, where that's a growth area for the collection, so it is for us as well. We're always interested in original content. How much of this collection is going to be your work, your research notes, your published papers, your drafts, presentations you've given, photographs you've taken, correspondence with your peers, memoranda, your academic relationships, your works with some of your students, that sort of thing we're interested in also. And as someone's already mentioned, we were talking earlier, anything electronic format. Yes, we want your physical papers. We also want your anything in electronic format. We'll take it in any format, but we would certainly like to know if it's readable. We'll try and figure out a way to make it readable. Size is a consideration for us. If you've been to the Frick, you've seen you may not have been into the stacks, but at this point, everything we have is on site. So we would have a very hard time digesting 300 linear feet of your records if that's what, in fact, you were sitting on. We could talk. We could sort of figure out if there was a way to bring that, to narrow it down and to bring it in. We're also interested in condition. If you've stored your records in your basement, your garage, your attic, your place with a great deal of temperature fluctuation, chances are they're not in the condition that they should be or that we would like them to be. So if something is really going to require a lot of time and treatment on our end, which translates into lots of money, we think about that also in terms of whether we're going to accept a gift or not. Geographic location of the archive. We will, most of our records come from, the tri-state area or the East Coast. We're not averse to taking collections from other parts of the country or from overseas, but that's a little bit more of a challenge. And duplication within the archive, I wonder a little bit, that is something, we're not interested in having an archive that is very much similar to something else, that it does not have enough original content in it for us to sort of say that this is really going to be the first place someone's going to go to look for this topic or to study this subject. And also, if it turns out it's a very large collection that's full of duplicates, just physical duplicates, we will try and sort of sort that out before it comes to us. Let's see, there are many legal aspects of acquisition that I think are for you to consider and for us to consider as well, one of which is, does any portion of the archive reside anywhere else? And that means if it's not with you, where is it? And if it is not with you, does someone else own it? And also, we're always interested if you've promised it to someone else, to another institution, in writing in particular. But if as a reminder that somewhere along the line, you made some sort of promise to another place that they would get your records. For us, it's very important that the donor consider giving relevant copyrights to the institution, so we can, publish it, put it in exhibitions, allow other people to consult it freely, give permission for them to publish excerpts from it, if, at a later date. But this is something that we work out in a gift agreement with you. And if you want an appraisal for this collection, the Frick, no institution should be offering to do your appraisal for you. This is something that's on you. We provide you with the tax forms that you can pass on to the federal government, where you've got your appraisal done. And if you want an appraisal, it's best to have it done before it comes to us. Afterwards, arranging for an appraiser to come in and poke around in our offices for your appraisal we've done it a couple of times, but it's really not the best way for you to approach this. And will the archive be given free of access restrictions? We really are not interested in taking in a collection that is going to be closed in perpetuity or for a very, very long time. We need to know that at some point it's all going to be open, with a few minor exceptions. And also, will the archivist be permitted to remove or discard the duplicates and out-of-scope materials? This is something we do. By discard, doesn't mean throw away, or to remove, we give them away. We offer them to someone else. If it's out of scope, then it can go there. Let's see. Physical logistics. Does the archive arrive during the lifetime of the scholar or after your death? We prefer while you're living, because then we can work with you. It's best to have the source of the information handy to talk about arrangement, description, significance, context, and unfortunately the legacy collections we have, which are great, I wasn't able to speak to a soul because they all had passed away by 1940. So, you guess some after that, and it's helpful, I think, to have a dialogue with the donor. Will the archive arrive in separate accretions over time? We are perfectly happy to do that. If you want to give us some of your material now, we'll take it now, and we'll take the rest later, as long as it's part of the agreement that that's what we will do. Who covers the expenses in transporting the archive to the repository? Usually, if it's just boxing up a few things in a boxes and putting them in a taxi, that's no one worries so much about that. But each gift is different. The Frick generally will cover sort of the cost of transporting the collection, but within reason. But if it's also something that it ends up being your responsibility to get it ready to go. As the archive coming from overseas, that is its own can of worms. Because there's a lot more paperwork, and it's very possible that the country where these papers are coming from might object if there's an issue, and that's something for the scholar to sort out. But we do have collections from scholars from France and England that have given us their papers. And as I touched on this earlier, is the archive too large to fit into existing storage areas? I think there isn't an institution anywhere that doesn't have space considerations. So if you're able to get it down to, as Susan was mentioning, sort of to curate it before it comes to us, to get it to the size you think it's at its optimum, we would appreciate that. And if it does have to go off-site for storage, who pays for that and for how long? And that's just hasn't come up yet, but we have a collection that's not scholars' papers that is gigantic, which we will eventually receive, and I'm wondering to myself, once this person passes away, these 500 linear feet of material, and they're in a storage facility, I mean, we have to digest that somehow. Let's see. I'm sorry, this is a little dry, but really, I think if you want, this will all be available for whenever you want them, and you're free to give me a buzz and talk further about it. The deed of gift I mentioned, which can be a couple of paragraphs if it's that simple, and sort of we attach a brief inventory of what it is that you're offering to us. Everybody countersigns 2 copies, you keep 1, we keep 1, and then you're done. That's perfect. That doesn't always happen. After we've got the collection, we'll do a more detailed preliminary inventory. We don't promise how quickly we'll get it done, but we work on that. And then once it's in, we also check for mold, insects, or other hazards and arrange treatment accordingly. We have a state-of-the-art conservation lab at the Frick and at the Frick Art Reference Library, and anything that has a problem, we shuttle up there very quickly and they treat it for us. We survey the archive for electronic media, disc tapes, thumb drives, all of that, and figure out what to do with those. We also survey the archive for photographs, negative slides, all these sorts of things, nitrate in particular, so we can separate that and either scan it immediately or get it out of there. So I have to hustle my bustle here. Let's see. Check for problematic materials. Don't send us your medical records, pornography, sensitive information, credit card information, and especially student information. You probably have recommendations for students, grades, discussions if you're a faculty member, and there are very strict rules about making that available. Choosing a repository. The easy choices are your alma mater, undergraduate or graduate, your employing institution, institutions with related collections. In this room, that would be Archives of American Art, Frick Art Reference Library, the Getty Research Institute, something that's close to you, or an institution that's willing to pay for your archive. Access, this is our policy. We don't restrict access. We don't make materials available to the public without having reviewed the contents and put a finding aid together, at least online or freely available. We don't commit to making a timetable, to making the archive available to researchers to a specific timetable. And we do not permit select access to collections or allow donors to dictate who can have access. We have 17 collections on the website here, our website. And in general, people looking for things on specific paintings, not so much these early materials. The American paintings collections are a strength of our library. No one has come in yet to do a history or interested in yet the full history of a particular scholar with the records we've got. Let's see. This is just the Art Scholarship webpage you can go to, and it lists the links to the finding aids for the collections we have. If you want to see how they're organized, this is one of a finding aid. This is the Lawrence Park files on Gilbert Stuart. And finally, this is just sort of a side note. Sometimes you have libraries you also want to give to, along with your archive, and that is a separate issue at the Frick Art Reference Library, the Libraries Acquisition Committee, and those collections are generally integrated into our regular collections, but although we do keep them together virtually, and the same rule applies that I mentioned there. We don't commit to keeping all publications. We'll sell or donate duplicate or out-of-scope material, or just hold on to a special one. If it's relevant to the archive, we will. We'll keep it and retain it. And that's it.
Okay, Susan had asked me to speak about practical arrangements from the point of view of a scholar. I have two kinds of experience with this. One is preparing Leo Steinberg's papers for transfer to the Getty Research Institute, and he had course notebooks from his graduate student days, professional correspondence, complete set of published articles with notes and photos, biographical material, subject files, just, what a scholar does in thousands of pieces of paper in 60 years. I'm also working on preparing the Saul Steinberg research collection for the Beinecke Library. Now, Saul, and I'm going to have to call them by first name, Saul bequeathed his papers to the Beinecke, but he never kept records himself of artworks or photographs, exhibitions, publication records. So there's some of this material at the Beinecke that's related to artworks, but his very large and complex oeuvre and the trajectory of his career can't be assembled from the Beinecke works alone. So what I've been doing for 17 years is creating files, paper, digital, image files and content files that create a kind of connective tissue, so somebody going through the original papers at the Beinecke has a frame of reference for what they're looking at. Some of the material I have been collecting comes from other archives, Saul's military records, OSS records, records from university in Italy, other scholars' papers, and this presents another problem, which I'll get to in a minute. So what I'm going to be talking about is what one ought to do before you actually approach an organization, institution, with your papers. And the main thing is to organize them and clearly describe what you're offering so that it will be of greater interest, and also it will reassure the institution that whatever they're getting will not require a massive amount of sorting and identifying on the part of the archivist. The first thing you have to consider, which Sally just mentioned, is whether you want this to be a lifetime or a testamentary bequest. That is a personal decision that has many ramifications, including how much you're going to need the material in your lifetime. Then, how much to include, and that depends on how you perceive the collection is going to be used. Is it going to be used as a resource for scholars working in your field, or is it as well going to be some reference material for your biography, the history of your scholarship and your career? I would recommend resisting the impulse to pare things down too much, not to look at a piece of paper and say, oh, nobody's going to be interested in this, because every researcher brings their own set of criteria and might well find something that you just tossed off as uninteresting as valuable for whatever they're doing. You have to deliver the material in a way that will make all its components clear. I find that, I'm talking now about Leo's papers, I made a very detailed box list so that immediately the archivist knew what was in every box, and every folder was identified. The important thing to remember is that neither the archivist nor future researchers have your familiarity with every piece of paper. And the best way to handle the question of what do I tell them and what don't I tell them is to just put yourself in the place of that innocent eye and say, okay, here's somebody who doesn't know me or this subject from Adam, and what are they going to make of this piece of paper? Among the things, for example, if you have correspondence that's only signed with one name, pencil in the person's full name. And if it's a person who is not easily found on the web, someone who is not a published professional or something, put a little note in. This is, my cousin so-and-so who saw such and such and wrote me about it. You might think that's unimportant, but you never know. And my criterion is, okay, you never know, put it in. Don't separate correspondence about a project from the papers on the project itself, because if you do, it may be clear to you that this person was writing to you about a certain project, but it may not be clear to the person who's going to read it in the future. In other words, and archivists here may argue with me, you can separate it out later, but when you give it, the correspondence with the project should not be separated as a correspondence file. It should be with the particular project. And then I think we all have by now shorthand abbreviations and notations that are comprehensible only to us. If your papers are punctuated with this kind of material, then include a glossary. Such and such means. I have a system, an upward arrow means more or increase, the rightward arrow means because, and, over the years you just make little notations, and this should be made clear. Sometimes a short narrative that explains the background of a particular document or set of documents is useful, and I'll give you one example. Leo had a copy of Erwin Panofsky's famous book, Idea, A Concept in Art Theory, in the original German edition of 1924. His copy, which he bought secondhand, had the library stamp of Edgar Breitenbach. Now, Breitenbach was a German art historian who fled the Nazis. He taught in the U.S. He worked with the Monuments Men on recovering archives, books, and artworks that the Nazis had appropriated. And he spent the last 20 years of his life as chief of the Prints and Photographs Division of the Library of Congress. So he had a real presence in America. Now, Leo's copy also had an inscribed dedication to him by Panofsky. And here's where the story gets interesting and valuable for future researchers. One day in 1958, Leo ran into Panofsky near the Institute of Fine Arts and mentioned, "Oh my God, I was just reading your book, Idea." And he handed him the copy. And Panofsky was startled because when he saw Breitenbach's name, because Breitenbach had been his student in Germany, and Panofsky had already come to America, but he feared that the Breitenbach, as a young Jewish man, would not be allowed to take or pass his doctoral orals. So Panofsky went back to Germany expressly to sit on that doctoral committee and make sure that Breitenbach passed. And then later, when Breitenbach came to America, Panofsky got him some teaching posts. This narrative is essential to understanding Panofsky's inscription, which reads, "Inscribed to Mr. Leo Steinberg in witness of direct apostolic succession, April 8th, 1958, Erwin Panofsky." As Leo mentioned, Panofsky turned around the Catholic concept of apostolic succession to refer to the Jews who, like Panofsky, Breitenbach, and Leo himself, had to flee Germany and ultimately found refuge in America. With this story, the book becomes not just some inscribed copy of a famous book, but an artifact of friendship, of scholarship, and of the history of art history in America. So there's a little 2-paragraph narrative that's attached to the book. About Saul Steinberg, different kind of notation. For example, I've assembled 5 fat loose-leaf notebooks of all of Saul's New Yorker drawings. And I'm appending a note to it that explains that these notebooks represent the only complete set of New Yorker, Saul's contributions to the New Yorker, because one would assume wrongly that the New Yorker's database is complete. It's not. And one would also assume that you could find them all in the New Yorker's online website where they have all the issues. It's not, because that's just a big fat PDF, and you can only search for what has been indexed, and the indexers missed a lot. So there's 2 entirely different kinds of explanatory notations, each one with its own type of relevance. Among other things that can be included, if you include unpublished or abandoned projects, indicate at what stage they are. This is a rough draft of, this is the final draft of, and perhaps too, why they remained unpublished. I gave up on it, I got bored with it, or I couldn't find a publisher. Now, this is something Sally addressed briefly, and some of you may also. If you have online URL references in your papers, like for such and such, see www, blah, blah. I find it's always a good idea to print them out because websites are not forever. They change, they disappear, and even apart from anyone's papers, I normally transfer everything on a website, the relevant parts, to a Word file headed by the URL and the date I accessed it. Then you have it. And too many times I've gone back to a URL I innocently recorded 10, 15 years ago, and it just doesn't exist anymore. Now, Sally mentioned recommendations. I was going to do that too. I didn't know there were strict rules about it, honestly. Leo had a massive set of recommendations written over 50 years, and we decided that they should be destroyed because they were written in confidence. And even a positive recommendation might not be suitable for public eyes. So he said, destroy them, and that's what I did. Now, the digital material is another issue that I'm really not expert in what libraries or institutions want to do with them. Sally suggested that the Frick, will take it. I think this is something you need to discuss with the library or the university or the institution that's taking them. But if you do, I would put them in stable formats. In other words, if you give Word files, make them read-only. If you give PDFs, put the security function on so that they can't be altered. Again, something to be discussed with each library, but it is a problem that is more and more under discussion. Then the question of the copyright to your papers, it depends on the policy of the institution. If you make a lifetime bequest, you may be able to hold on to the copyright in your lifetime, passing it to the institution at your death. And then what the library does with that copyright will, of course, depend on the rules of the library, whether they will allow scholars to make copies and so forth. And there is one problem, which I'll end with quickly, which is that apparently libraries are not allowed to make copies of works they don't own, whether paper or images. So if you have images of works of art, in principle, the library will not be able to offer scholars a copy of it. Now, whereas they can take notes from documents, for instance, in your archives that come from other archives, they can't do it with a picture. I would suggest that you hold a set of any high-res scans you have for whoever inherits your copyright, because if they want to republish something, it'll be the devil to get those scans again. And lastly, although this isn't a direct matter of this session, think about to whom you pass your copyright. It has to be done in your will, and it should be someone who is at least a generation younger than you and somewhat familiar with the process of publication. On the other hand, this may just be my obsession with details and contingencies. You won't be here, you won't know, and you can give your copyright to whomever you want. Thank you.
Frederick Mason Perkins was among the most significant and best-known early 20th century American art historians, as demonstrated by his studies on Italian art from the 14th to the 16th centuries. His work was essential for the critical revival of the Italian primitives, as well as the definition of the new figure of the connoisseur in the art trade. Together with his mentor Bernard Berenson, Perkins generated new collecting interest in all of the previously lesser-known Italian artists active between Giotto and Raphael, through the numerous articles he published in both Italian and American journals, such as Le Arti and Art in America, during the first 5 decades of the 20th century. This role placed him in contact with a large number of American collectors, as he became the trusted advisor and direct dealer. Collectors such as Philip and Robert Lehman, George Blumenthal, Percy and Isidore Strauss, Paul Sachs, John G. Johnson, Simon Guggenheim, Ellen Clay Frick, among others, all interested in finding and buying examples of early Italian painting, started close business relationships with Perkins during the first decades of the 20th century. Perkins' research and critical analysis of these paintings contributed strongly to their circulation in the marketplace, thereby supporting the value of acquisitions made by collectors' friends. Frederick Mason Perkins was born in Hingham, Massachusetts, in 1874, and was still a child when he followed his father, a doctor, to the American Embassy in Shanghai. Although Protestant, Frederick's first educational experience in Shanghai was in a Jesuit school. At 20 years old, he went on a long trip through Europe, stopping in France, England, and Italy. When he arrived in Italy in 1897, he was so taken by its beauty that he took up a residence in Rome, then Siena, and then near Florence, in Sassoforte, where he purchased a villa. In 1915, he moved to Assisi, where he remained until his death in 1955. Upon his death, Perkins' private collection of Italian paintings from the 14th to the 16th centuries passed to the Franciscan friars of the Sacred Convent of Assisi. Today, it is still possible to visit this interesting repertoire of early Italian Renaissance painting, to which Federico Zeri dedicated a volume 2 in 1987. In his last will, Perkins, after converting to the Catholic Church, had also provided for the donation of his personal papers to the Bishop of Assisi. For nearly 60 years, the documents remained untouched in boxes inside the Bishop Palace without any order. In 2013, the current Bishop of Assisi appointed me as curator of the archive on the basis of my demonstrative experience researching the Vatican and Roman archives on materials from the 15th to the 18th century. I was given access to and responsibility for the complete organization of this copious amount of material. I was the first to consult the thousands of letters, photographs, diaries, and notebooks in the archive. A treasure trove of information. This is the work in progress. This is the actual situation. As you can see from this summary slide, Perkins' conserved correspondence includes letters from some of the most prominent American collectors of the early 20th century. Additionally, the archive contains thousands of photographs of paintings that Perkins collected as study materials for his profession as an art writer and dealer. Photography was used in the early 20th century as an essential instrument for the work of connoisseurs and was simultaneously useful for commercial purposes to send an image of the object to potential buyers. Later, we will see some ways Perkins used photographs, in particular as a support to propose the purchase of paintings. As you can imagine, this enormous material represents an extraordinary and unique resource not only to get to know Perkins, but also to broaden and in certain cases re-examine our knowledge of the people Perkins was in contact with, as well as the general context of the American collecting taste and art market of the early Novecento. Now, I will illustrate how I organized the documentation. I ordered the material in series and sub-series. Correspondence with letters from 1892 to 1970, including a sub-series, general correspondence, original senders, family letters. A second series, financial papers. A third one, manuscripts and notes, including as a sub-series, notebooks and diaries, historical notes for articles and drafts, the Vasari's notes and published manuscript, and finally, the photo collection. The general correspondence includes letters from senders not directly related to Perkins' activity as a scholar and advisor. The second subseries, original senders, is actually formed by interlocutors belonging to the community of dealers, collectors, and scholars who were in touch with Perkins. I named it Original Senders because it is based on a pre-existing selection by Perkins himself, as you can see from this slide. You can see the name of the senders on the envelope. The family correspondence includes interesting letters from the two of Perkins' wives, Lucy Olcott and Irene Vedder. These papers reveal the contribution made by the two women to Perkins' career as a scholar and art trader. In particular, Lucy served as a liaison with Bernard and Mary Berenson, and Irene was Perkins' collaborator in the 1920s and 30s in finding and acquiring early Italian paintings. The financial paper section includes documentation related to properties, trips, bank accounts, receipts, and among them some proofs of Perkins' art trading, like this one. In the manuscript section are collected 24 travel notebooks and diaries related to trips Perkins made through Italy from the late 19th to the early 20th century. They are a particularly fascinating resource to reconstruct Perkins' visual and cultural experiences at the beginning of his stay in Italy. The manuscript sections also includes thousands of sheets with unwritten notes that record historical data related to artists, monuments, and periods that Perkins used for his articles. Unfortunately, Perkins' library has been dispersed, making these notes the most important evidence for reconstructing Perkins' methodological approach and the development of his knowledge about Italian Renaissance art. The so-called Vasaris Notes manuscript deserves a particular mention. Perkins elaborated this work for more than 20 years, before ultimately leaving it unpublished. The reason of this choice is not clear. The preserved drafts, though, can now illustrate Perkins' general point of view about many Italian artists, in particular of those of the Chinese school of painting from the 14th to the 15th century, including his favorite ones such as Simone Martini and Duccio di Buoninsegna. Perkins' photo collection, preserved at Assisi, consists of about 10,000 images, mostly of paintings from the 13th to the 16th century, with a minor part dedicated to sculpture and architecture of the same period. The photos were formerly collected by Perkins himself in folders with the name of the artist on the cover, and I kept these criteria for the actual catalogue. This extraordinary repertoire of images covers the most important Italian schools of painting, especially the Sienese and Florentine ones, and points out the importance of the photographs as essential to Perkins' work as art scholar and art broker. I would like now to share some content from the Perkins archive and illustrate its extraordinary importance as a source for the study of American collecting interest in Italian Renaissance painting. During my research in the Assisi papers, I found information about numerous works that came to US thanks to or through Perkins, as shown in the slide. Letters and annotation on the back of the photographs provide essential information about provenance, ownership, attribution, and the state of conservation of these artworks. Some other examples to have an idea about the documentation. Furthermore, the archival documents reveal fundamental details about Perkins' role as a broker between dealers and collectors. For instance, we now know that Perkins usually received a 10% commission on each sale price for transactions in which he was directly involved. I would like now to share some important news about Perkins' photo collection. 2 years ago, the Berenson Library at Aitatti in Florence acquired from a private antiquarian in Assisi 8,000 photographs of artworks which originally belonged to Perkins as part of his private documents. After my recent visit to the Biblioteca Berenson at Aitatti, I can confirm that the materials are not duplicates, but complementary to the Assisi archive, In fact, they include additional images of works by artists already represented in the Assisi archive. The photographs integrate perfectly into the lacunae in the Assisi files, which I've been searching to fill. For this reason, as curator of the Perkins archive, I'm now starting a collaboration with Itatti for a project which will include digitizing the images conserved in Assisi and reuniting them with the ones now in Florence. I would like now to conclude with a quote from a letter sent by Jesse Isidor Strauss to the director of the Toledo Museum of Art in 1926. Jesse and his brother Percy had already bought many Italian paintings with Perkins' assistance, and now Jesse wanted to endorse Perkins to become the Toledo Museum art reference advisor for the purchase of early Renaissance Italian painting. I'm still working to research Perkins' contribution to the Toledo Museum of Art collection, but Jesse's description of Perkins' skills as a connoisseur and scholar illuminate his fame among contemporaries. I quote, "Regarding Italian primitives of the 3rd, 14th, and 15th centuries, Frederick Mason Perkins is, in my judgment, the man best fitted in Italy, from the point of view of knowledge, experience, taste, judgment, and character, to represent the Toledo Museum there. There are two men who are recognized as outstanding connoisseurs of Italian art, Berenson and Perkins. I know them both. I don't know just what arrangement can be made with Perkins. Neither Percy nor I buy practically anything in Italy without having secured his judgment. Perkins is in great demand. Thank you."
Well, there'll be no theory, no philosophy, no large imaginings in my talk. This is a service piece, a distillation of findings and anecdotes from the field, gleaned from my experience as a former documents collector for the Archives of American Art, as someone who has collected documents for the Roy Lichtenstein Foundation, as someone who has been the executor for the estates of 2 art historians, and as someone who has placed portions of her own papers in various archives. So first, I want to make 3 main points before offering more specific guidance in placing your papers in a public repository. 1, if you want something done the way you want it done, do it before you die. No one cares about your papers or knows as much about them as you do. No matter how careful you are, your executor will not be able to divine every nuance or decision that you would prefer. 2, for art historians, the papers are usually not about you. They're about the art, artists, and art movements you've studied and the perceived significance of the subject. For example, if you have an artist's financial records, those would be of interest to an archive, but not your own tax returns. No, I've seen them, trust me. No scrapbooks with hundreds of pictures of your grandchildren. Granted, based on the possibility that your grandchild might grow up to be Susan Sontag or Micheline Thomas or Mark Rothko, you can include a few. More on this later. 3, do not expect to be able to sell your papers unless you are mega distinguished in the field for the contributions you've made. You can look at the names of the critics and art historians whose papers the Getty has purchased, such as Clement Greenberg, Barbara Rose, and Irving Sandler. And I don't know if the Getty purchased the Leo Steinberg papers or not, or if they were donated. And if your name has similar star power and intellectual heft, then it's worth a try. Or if you have primary unpublished documents such as letters, diaries, and interviews with an individual or group of surpassing importance. However, I recently heard from Lucy Freeman Sandler, Irving's widow, that the Getty is no longer buying papers in the same way that they did, and that she will have to donate the remaining Sandler papers to the Getty. which she will do. So expect to donate your paper somewhere. And believe me, it's not always so easy even to give things away because everyone's running out of room and digitizing is not a financial option for all institutions. If you locate a receptive archive that is not physically near you, it is likely that they will pay for boxes and shipping, as Sally indicated, but don't expect much else. What kind of papers are most desirable? I think it's best to follow the guidelines of the Archives of American Art. And I should say right now that Liza Kerwin, the Deputy Director of the Archives of American Art, is with us today. So please feel free to swarm her after our discussion. She's in black and about 5 rows. Yes, there she is. She's daring to put her hand up. Anyway, most valuable are primary sources: original letters, diaries, journals, and other unpublished writings, preliminary sketches, scrapbooks, photographs, financial and administrative records, interview tapes and archives, and the like, that have significant research value for the study of art in America. To this, I'd add exhibition catalogs and announcements with a qualification, small ones that might not otherwise have been saved. A fleeting storefront gallery in the East Village that issued a few catalogs or brochures would be of archival interest. A catalog from the Met or MoMA usually isn't, only because so many libraries will have the copy already. Minutes of meetings are useful, as are mission statements. So personal papers of individuals and the records of organizations that include letters from or references to prominent figures in American cultural history, a significant body of unpublished manuscript material, and documentation on artists or events in the art world. For catalog raisonné scholars, I would expect them to have assembled the largest body of known information on their artists, and that mass, of course, is going to be important. Now, obviously, catalog raisonné records have sensitive and confidential information regarding provenance, prices, and other matters that might not be immediately disclosable, but ledgers and sales records are invaluable. If the information is going to be restricted indefinitely, as Sally suggested, an archive may not want to take the papers because they will not be able to make them available. So you're going to have to think about reasonable restrictions that will not violate your agreements to maintain confidences. Or you'll have to have that one subject area restricted and everything else available. If you have manuscripts, you should include original versions as well as final computer drafts. So, about you. Your professional career should be included, as your activities are related to the larger picture of art in America. Letters, articles, manuscripts, lectures, photographs, recordings, and personal correspondence are part of that too. So are teaching materials, CVs, bibliographies, conference notes, and handouts. But do not include medical bills, bank statements, and other records that have nothing to do with your professional career. Since you've all done research in major archives, by now you should inherently know what is of interest and what is not. Where do you donate your papers? Now, the ideal situation is to give all of your papers to one institution to establish a relationship with it and donate over the years. But that doesn't always work out, especially if you're working on different kinds of subjects. Sometimes you may have to split them up. If you're working on a European artist, the AAA, the most obvious repository, may not want them because the focus is more on America and American art. Thus, you must use archival ingenuity and cast a wide net. Move beyond the big, obvious art research institutions like the Getty or the AAA. Other well-known institutions that take art-related papers but do not come to mind as often to art historians are the Library of Congress, the New York Public Library, the Huntington Library in San Marino, and the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas at Austin, the last of which is mostly known for literary manuscripts but does acquire some art-related papers. You have to start thinking local or think in regard to the subject of the papers. Let's pretend you're working on a catalogue raisonné of a German expressionist. Perhaps you should think about asking the Robert Gore Rifkin Center in Los Angeles or the Bush Reisinger Museum at Harvard if they would like the papers. If they're not interested, you should contact museums and archives in Germany or any other institution with large holdings of your artist. If you're working on British art, you should consider the Yale Center for British Art or the Tate Gallery, which has an excellent archival research center. If you're working on British sculpture, you should consider the Henry Moore Sculpture Institute in Leeds. You may have consulted such institutions during your research, so going back years later with a donation would make sense. Let's also think about other types of places. If you're working on an American subject, of course try the AAA, which Liza Kerwin told me does contain the papers of more than 245 art historians. But if that's not going to work out, there are a number of research centers in art that smaller museums around the country have established for American art that are eager for papers, such as the one at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum in New Mexico, Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Arkansas, Amon Carter Museum in Texas, and the Fort Lauderdale Museum of Art in Florida. I myself donated a group of papers that the AAA was not interested in to Fort Lauderdale, even though I have donated in the past to the Archives of American Art. Doubtless I'm overlooking institutions in the Midwest and the West Coast because they are there. Now, another way to go is a targeted strategy. For example, the art historian Lloyd Goodrich left the papers he created after his long tenure at the Whitney Museum to several institutions. His general papers went to the Archives of American Art, his research on Thomas Eakins went to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and his research on Winslow Homer and the Homer Catalog Raisonné went to Abigail Booth Gertz, who finished the Catalog Raisonné. Now, you should also think about special collections in university libraries around the country. If you're affiliated with a university, it might take your papers. If you're an alum of a university, you might ask that institution's special collections library if it's interested. I am the literary executor for Catherine Cooke, and I was partly in charge of delivering her archives and art to her beneficiaries after she died. The art went to the Art Institute of Chicago, the papers went to the Archives of American Art, and her library, which had many books inscribed to her by the artists she knew, went to Vassar, as she was in the class of 1925. Harvard, Princeton, Columbia, Syracuse, the University of Pennsylvania, the Newberry Library in Chicago, the University of Chicago, UC Berkeley, and many other universities have manuscript collections. Similarly, there are historical societies. If your subject has local or regional interest, you might think about putting the material there. If you're working on something having to do with a woman artist or women in the art world, you can try the Bunting Institute at Radcliffe or the National Museum of Women in the Arts. So as you see, this does take some time and effort, so you really have to start long in advance of an actual donation to find an institution that will accept it. If you find that institution that will accept the papers before you're ready to relinquish them, I would look into getting and signing a promised gift form, which will ensure the donation for both sides. Keep these forms with other papers that you or others will need to find when the time comes. Which brings me to the point that many times we don't get things done so quickly, and there's always the possibility of being hit by that speeding bus. And a corollary to that point is any dollar spent on a lawyer for a will spelling out your intentions and bequests are dollars well spent. And I'm not a shill of the legal industry, but I've seen what happens. Your intention and your desire may be to leave everything to Institution A, but unless that intention is made explicit and made good in law, it may not happen. Your executors will have to carry out the intentions of the last surviving executed in law will, even if its provisions are no longer what you want. And in regard to the physical will itself, make sure you have given a copy to a relative or an obvious friend for safekeeping. If your will is locked in your apartment or house and the only other copy is with your attorney, what happens if your friends, colleagues, or relatives don't know who that attorney is? It will take a court order and great effort to get into the apartment or house to find that will. If someone obvious has a copy of that will or knows the attorney who drew it up, the process will proceed far more smoothly, and weeks and months won't be lost in the court system. Now, this is pretty deep in the weeds, but if your will is complex and you want your executors, especially if they are not relatives, to carry out a lot of tasks, you should also consider leaving them some extra money to make it possible for them to labor for you. It may be news to some of you that someone you ask to be your executor can decline to serve. There is no legal obligation to serve, and if your executor declines the job, in New York State, at least, your estate will be put in the hands of the public administrator, who is usually a friend of the judge, because he or she will get a nice fee from your estate for lip service fulfillment of the will, and who does not care about libraries and archives. The public administrator is never going to be a scholar. So, think in advance, think local, think widespread, think legal, think realistic, and you should be able to find a home for your papers. Thank you.
So I'm going to invite all of the panelists to come to the table. I'll ask one question to get the Q&A session started, but then open it to the floor. One question I'd like to ask each of the panelists is, we've been working on the assumption that scholars' papers have value and should be preserved and will be of interest to other people. And I'd like to, and this is something that Fausto certainly talked about, I think more explicitly than perhaps the others, but I'm curious if each of you could perhaps elaborate on why you think scholars' papers are of interest, and to whom should they have value, and is there a history of the historiography of art scholarship that will draw on them, or is it only always in relationship to the subject of their research that the interest is derived? So if we want to start, Avis, maybe go in order from you.
Well, I can't imagine that scholars' papers wouldn't be of interest because of, if we care about history and the historical record. But, as we find out later on, it isn't even always about the historiography of art. People's papers have all kinds of things, and people themselves, it's completely widespread and different. And of course, if they've preserved records about an artist, and an artist who no one cared about at one point can become of extreme interest later. But for example, the Archives of American Art has the papers of an art journalist named Helen Appleton Reed, who was the art critic of the Brooklyn Eagle for many years. And it's good, they have it. She studied with Robert Henry, and they have all of her columns. But also, Helen Appleton Reed, when I was looking at her papers, this woman was a Nazi apologist and a promoter of Nazi ideology in the 1930s, and the reason she got fired from the Brooklyn Eagle was she was talking about the greatness of Hitler and the Herrenvolk and all of that. She had an affair with Fritzi Halfstengel. So in other words, maybe we only know this, but sooner or later other people, in other words, so sometimes people can have, there can be something else in those papers that we don't even know about. And for example, I don't think just because of who she was, she's known to American art historians, but those, I don't think anyone who has written about, say, fifth columnists in the United States has found her, but...
Now they have.
Yes. But I just would say that people, there are all kinds of reasons for preserving papers, and, that make themselves known, not just now, but later.
All right, well, I'll just be very brief. I do think there's value in scholars' papers. First of all, you have unpublished material, and some of this material may have been accumulated over the years that didn't work its way into the notes of whatever you've published, but there's a massive photocopies, notes you've taken on very obscure things that may not appear in the published work. You just use them as a basis, but they don't appear. And then, as Susan said, there may be an interest in following the career of a particular art historian, and how one works, even the trajectory of a career, is also part of the history of art history in America, which I think is an important, an important thing to record.
Yeah, we always take the long view of sort of when a record will become of interest to, it might possibly become of interest to the outside world. I find that most of the collections that we have of scholars' papers are used, as I said, for a single search. They're interested in their painting or following up on sort of works of art that they're working on for themselves, and not so much the scholar themselves. But we do find that, as you just mentioned, I think the value of the unpublished material is quite high. And some of these finding aids that we've put online, which is the way you get to our collections and of these sorts of papers, they've seen the publication, but they want to know what else this person was thinking about, or what other sort of small leads there might be that didn't make it into the finished product that will then lead them into some other areas for searching. And I would say this is, the Scholars Collect Papers collections is not our most heavily used series of records at the library, but it is consistently used, and it comes in from all kinds of places. We're always surprised who's doing work, how far afield they're doing it, and which collections that they're looking at. So yes, I think we're happy to have them.
Well, in my personal experience, Perkins Archive was a revelation, and my goal is to bring to light this incredible amount of material totally unpublished, and to share it with the community of scholars. And also I would like to retrieve Perkins' place, Perkins' contribution to the American art scholarship, because it was a little neglected by the lately generations of scholars, and it's time for him to be retrieved and reconsidered for his importance, his contributions, especially for the development of many private American collections, which now are public because they've been donated to the public museum. So when I proposed this research to the Frick, when I was fellow at the Frick or at the Metropolitan Museum, because the curators are interested in knowing these information about provenance, ownership, and state of conservation at the moment of acquisitions of these artworks by the former owners before the donation to the museum. So I think that it's an important job.
I would say that we had a nice opportunity to work with Fausto a few years ago, and we have a great deal of correspondence from Perkins to Helen Clay Frick, which has been put just in our library correspondence or in her own personal files. So his work has given us the opportunity to sort of consolidate all of our Perkins material and sort of feed it into the project he's working on. And he's been a very generous scholar or collaborator with us. And we have a small piece of what it is he's doing, but this is a perfect example of things that we've just had sitting around, knew they were interesting, but didn't know quite how it would fit in, because we don't have the opportunity really, or this whole cache of records, sitting in Assisi was an eye-opener for us. It is very exciting. So it's been a very nice connection.
And I'd also like to add, just in terms of calabrese research, calabrese sometimes don't get completed by the original author. before they do get completed, but then later, years later, they're revised. And it can be extremely helpful to have access to the original papers, including documents that were gathered, but also often notes that support something such as a decision about attribution or a decision about dating. You may ultimately disagree with that, but it's very helpful to know why someone preceding you made that choice and what their argumentation and evidence for it was. So I think any of us who have been in those situations have been very grateful to find, either from the original holder personally or in an archive, some evidence of that earlier work that supports where we are trying to go with our own work. So now I'd like to open it to the floor. If you have a question for a particular person, indicate that. Otherwise, just state the question, and whoever would like to take it can take it out to you. Yes?
This may be a question that's specific to everybody's individual papers, but I'm not clear how this material should be organized. I mean, for instance, I worked for a paper as an art critic. I have files of clippings, I have correspondence, I have ephemera, a lot of catalogs and announcements. Now, do you organize that chronologically? Do you organize it by who you were working for at the time? Do you organize it by media? Or is there a way to answer?
Yes. I would say organize it in whatever way makes the most sense to you who know the material, thinking ahead to people who are going to use it. You just have to put yourself in the mindset of someone looking at it. There's no one way. It's generated by the nature of the material and the logic of how it's going to be used.
Yeah, I would add to that is if you have a system and it's there, it's also, don't disturb it too much, because it kind of also gives you insight into the mind of you, the sensibility of you, and what you thought and what. So, if there's a logic of, if it's just all in boxes, but if you've got it correspondence and if you've got things separated that are quite logical, I think it's possible to keep that order. But as Sheila suggested, maybe putting some explanatory notes and some annotation is what is probably going to be helpful.
Yes, yeah, you're answering a lot of my questions, but I'm thinking specifically of catalog raisonné files when they're given. It sounds like you would keep them as they are structured prior to publication. But is that, have you ever seen a catalog raisonné given intact and there is a publication? How they've worked it out in the gifting? Is it left exactly as it was? Often you have to have a concordance, the numbers are changed. There's a certain mental rationale behind the way the works on paper are dealt with versus the oils, that kind of thing. Do you have any suggestions as to how it should be manipulated, even though it is organized? Is there a certain way that a catalog raisonné should be donated?
I would say ask Liza after
Or
we're
there
done.
may be someone in the audience who can speak to that. I can't think offhand. I know of the case of papers supporting the catalog raisonné, but I'm not familiar with the actual donation of the catalog raisonné. But Wendy?
I worked on the Maurice and Charles Prendergast catalog raisonné, which is at the Williams College Museum of Art, because it was a project there. And I would say it is there intact as we left it, but this business of explanatory notes on why we did what we did. I mean, the twists and turns, there was one electronic system and that didn't work, so everything had to go to a new electronic system. But I think this idea of leaving it as it is rather than trying in terms of this was your rationale, I think is the easier thing to do than to try to go back and come up with some other kind of rationale for all of that. So someone using those papers are going to see this originally had one numbering system, then it got another number, the traces are all there. And I was struck by the comment about, give a glossary and things. All of those things have initials, and I hope somebody left a glossary of whose initials were decided what.
Me?
I'm sorry, next to you, but Pat Hill behind you.
Go ahead.
Okay, I don't know how many of us are artists here, but I'm an artist. So it was extremely helpful and educational for me to hear you all. Thank you very much. I appreciate you getting into the weeds. So I have two related questions. One is, because I'm of a certain age, myself and many of my colleagues as artists are trying to do our own archives to get everything organized to have a legacy and pass along. So the first part of my question is, what advice would you give contemporary artists to prepare our legacy to work with a scholar? That's one important question to me. And the other is, in talking with a very famous artist about exactly this project and our journals, because many of us keep journals, she said, well, no one would be interested because all I wrote was, he left me. So my question is, especially from a feminist point of view, how important are things like that?
Of the highest.
If it explains a change in your style or a change in the iconography, that statement, he left me, may have great value. I mean, it's very difficult to, I think the advice to, when in doubt, don't throw out. Although obviously, there has to be some reasonableness with that, is good. But anyone else on the panel want to talk about artists in particular and how they might prepare for working with scholars later?
Well, I just want to say that, fewer and fewer people keep diaries or write journals, so anything personal like that is so rare that if anything, and especially many artists have drawings in there, in other words, you should always keep anything one of the kind that you essentially made yourself. But I do know many artists do, hire archivists, or they hire graduate students to help them.
Thank you.
I mean, that's the easiest way to go.
Katie?
Just one comment to that. The Joan Mitchell Foundation has created several workbooks for artists who are dealing with these exact issues, and you can go to their website and download those for free. There's one for executors, there's one for artists as well. So that's a free available resource for artists to look into.
In the far back.
I just wanted to say that at 2 o'clock, there's a panel on artist legacy, and we have someone from the Joan Mitchell Foundation, so Siobhan Nichols-Ortiz will be there.
Great, thank you. Jane?
I have a practical question. Since most archives are on paper, what does one do with email exchanges between scholars or among scholars about a specific work or authenticity or date, or what do we do with these thousands of emails? Do we print them? Do we what?
Well, I'm not speaking from a library's point of view, but I would print them out or copy them to a Word file with all the, to, from, subject thing. Because unlike Word files or picture files or Excel files, you can't copy a single file from an email program. So that's the only way to do it.
Stanford has an open source software. Stanford University has an open source software for archival treatment of email.
Yeah, this is a growth area in my profession, and not one that I am actually that much of an expert at, but there is, we certainly, as I mentioned, take people's electronic files, including their email files. How you make those available is sort of a big topic of discussion, because there aren't any very efficient ways right now to strip out information that can't be made public. So, I mean, it's not possible for one person to sort of vet every piece of email or view it as correspondence and then release it to a researcher. And you just have to be careful with that. But this is really seriously a big growth area in my universe. And I think there is a way to sort of get all that off onto a thumb drive and just hand it to the archivist and say, deal with it. Yeah. And, you know, for instance, we get materials, I mean, things that we come into the archives electronically. We have a digital preservation system, which we use called Preservica. Other places use other systems. And at this point, we're just sort of dumping these things in there to be sort of dealt with at a later date. But at least they're retained. And we have a guarantee, at least we think it's a guarantee with this company and this organization, that they'll migrate everything to whatever system they need to make sure that you can always retrieve this information. That's what we do. So yeah, just
Sorry, in the corner.
don't delete it.
I have two questions. The first one is, you talked about appraisals. It used to be that if something wasn't appraised for the Archives of American Art, you got a taxable donation. My understanding is that that's new tax laws make it any charitable donation you don't get. Is that true? Do you know anything about that?
Not yet.
And my second question is, if there is correspondence that shows the sender in a bad light, a really bad light, and you give that correspondence, does the recipient get in trouble, or what happens?
Well, if everybody's dead, it doesn't matter. In terms of the appraisal issue, I don't really know. We every year, we have 2 or 3 people who want an appraisal for something they've given us, and I send the form to our director or the chief librarian to sign off on. And how that's used, I don't know. I don't know what the new rules are. I just, you know, we were sort of hands off on that. We just, you know, we let people know from the beginning that we won't be able to help them with their appraisal. We could direct them to the website for the Archives of America, or the American Appraisers Society, or mention a couple, you know, the people we've worked with in the past, but that's it.
Liza, did you have an
I was
answer?
going to say that you can still take a tax deduction for a non-cash gift to a nonprofit institution. So far, we have to keep an eye on that.
And the center is.
I'm an appraiser, and I'm certified appraiser with the Appraisers Association of America. I just wanted to say that each case is different, but one rule that you should be aware of is that there are limits to what you can deduct if you are the author of the work that you are donating. But I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards.
And what about the letter that, sort of incriminating letter that one might get the recipient of?
I think that's a legal matter rather than an appraisal matter.
In the back, the redhead woman?
I think we have to remember, before printing out a lot of emails, one can take a photo and can be a digital photo, and we don't have to use as much paper and as much ink. Conservation is an important topic.
And then,
Well, I think that maybe you've answered the question, but what about us that had double lives? When we were going through graduate school, we were involved in the women's movement, we were involved in the anti-war movement, and we have a few papers having to do with that aspect of ourselves. Now, I always knew that you would be interested in artists who were involved with political activism. But what about those of us who were doing all these other things while we were also getting our PhDs and as an early scholar?
I would say that you have more chance of, putting that material, I mean, you could try the Bunting Institute, but I think, doesn't Emory University have a large civil rights archive? I think in terms of social justice, I think there were probably many other more libraries, I think you have more if wherever you're giving your art historical papers is not interested.
So maybe breaking them off?
Excuse me?
Breaking that?
Well, if the institution who's taking your art-related papers isn't interested, then I would break them off. Princeton might be interested. I think that there are, a lot of, politics. New York University politics there are a lot more that take political papers than art papers.
Say women's corpus for art.
Yeah. Oh, that would be an art. That would be art.
They don't archive individual
Those didn't write your papers, Pat. We already have Mark.
I think you solved the problem just now.
And yes.
A lot of us have done research over the years, not thinking of the end product. This is a kind of basic question. Not thinking of not thinking of the future, death, in short. And now this panel has been very illuminating. Thank you all. In terms of trying to determine what in that rather large amount of material that one has saved and accumulated, how does one go about deciding what is valuable, what would be interesting? You can't just dump your whole archive on some institution, and you have to sort of sort through it and decide. This is a basic question. Perhaps you could answer it.
Well, I'll just add, because and the other panelists may add, but each of their talks, I think, in a way addressed it. And to me, at least, it comes down to a basic act of essentially empathy. You can make a list of who you think might be interested. Might it be a student? Might it be another artist? Might it be an art collector? Might it be et cetera, et cetera? And then sort of using that lens, sort of survey your papers and get a sense of what, how someone else coming to them, what might they, so that it's not just your own view, which can be either sometimes grandiose or sometimes too modest, but to try to think in terms of the institutions and who uses those institutions, what types of questions they might be asking that your papers might be able to provide an answer or a partial answer. But if anyone else has something to, again, add?
I would just say you should look at the finding aids of various archives and institutions and see what's, what is in there, the kinds of things that are in the other, in collections that might be similar to what you have, and just emulate, analyze and emulate what's there, and do something similar.
I think we have to call an end. I really am grateful for your attendance, your questions, and for the panelists for the superb papers that everyone gave. Thank you very much.